this is gonna be a problem.
Hold on to your butts.
If you haven't already heard, the developers behind Dauntless have announced on social media that starting on May 29th, 2025, the game will be shut down. As with all of these games, unfortunately, the devs came out with a nice little thank you message to all the players who supported them up until this point. On Steam, however, the message was a little bit more depressing. On Steam, it basically just tells players, hey, Dauntless is shutting down. Bye. It's really unfortunate when you think about it, because Dauntless was actually a really fun game. Like all good things, this one must come to an end, but unfortunately, it didn't really have to. If you aren't already familiar with Dauntless, it was basically a Monster Hunter clone that competed in the free-to-play market. It was a lot of fun. And for the mega titan that the Monster Hunter franchise is, this game competed quite well. Now, Dauntless had its own set of development issues that eventually led to the game's downfall. But this is becoming a trend I think we'll see repeat in the near future when it comes to other live service games, which is really what this video is about. Ever since the launch of Fortnite, it became evidently clear to these development studios that free-to-play live service games were the way to go when looking for a profit. And when you see how successful Fortnite was because of its live service technique, it's not hard to see why. But recently we've seen a lot of games using this formula crash and burn, and the few that have managed to survive have been fighting tooth and nail to keep what remains of their communities. It's starting to feel like the lifespan on a lot of these games is beginning to run out. Even Fortnite has recently decided to bridge out from its traditional battle royale and create different game modes. And even when you look at the active player base for a lot of these new modes, the numbers are plummeting. You've probably heard of this other game that recently shut down called MultiVersus. If you aren't already familiar with MultiVersus, it was basically a Smash Brothers game with Warner Brothers characters. That game shut down within a year of its release, and the developers still didn't refund players who had spent money on the game. Which is already a terrible look for the studio behind the game, but when it comes to live service games as a whole, this is a pretty unattractive sentiment. I've spent hundreds of dollars on Fortnite cosmetics. I'm sure there are people out there who have spent thousands, and while that game isn't necessarily at risk of ever shutting down, plenty of other live service games that were built off microtransactions actually are. And if that happens, anybody who spent money on the game will lose everything they spent money on. Which I think is something that a lot of people are aware of at the time that they buy this stuff, but children definitely are not. Which is kind of concerning when you consider how easily accessible a lot of these games are to children. Children don't have to ask for their parents' credit card to play a free-to-play game. Of course, once they start playing that game, that very quickly changes. In-game cosmetics are shown off and advertised in a way that seems almost irresistible to most children. This is all stuff we've been really well aware of over the years. Addictive marketing mechanics and microtransactions aren't good for children. Wow, shocker. I promise I did not make this video just to tell you that. My point is, these video games are built around making a quick profit. They are not built for sustainability. And the worst part is, many developers are forced to choose between losing their jobs or listening to community feedback. Because believe me when I say, none of these developers opted to have loot boxes added to their games. It is almost always a decision made by higher ups. Black Ops 6 was seemingly the most well-received Call of Duty at launch in years. Since its release, the game has managed to lose almost every player it gained. This isn't because people thought the game was bad, but rather because corporate greed became so blatantly evident that people couldn't ignore it anymore. They have a $30 premium battle pass, and they use AI art. Overwatch 2 still hasn't managed to deliver on promises like PvE since launch. And at the end of the day, not receiving content is kind of a best case scenario for a lot of these games. As we've seen with Dauntless and with MultiVersus, oftentimes these games will just shut down. And for the past couple of years, receiving content on Dauntless was never really a good thing. See, since Forte Labs had taken over the previous studio, they would begin to make changes to the game in pursuit of a quick profit. These changes would include loot boxes and even the removal of content that was already in the game. Mind you, this was after Forte Labs had already laid off over over 100 employees from the previous studio. It was set in stone for these developers right away that if they didn't do what Forte Labs wanted them to, they would lose their jobs. And they still lost all their progress on the game when it would eventually shut down. And anyone who spent money on the game has essentially lost everything they paid for. This is the reality of free-to-play live service games. This is even true for Marvel Rivals. Listen, I have been loving the game. It's like the only game I've played for the past few months. You can unlock cosmetics for a discounted price or even for free using the in-game currency. And being able to revisit previous battle passes to unlock stuff that you might have missed is genuinely something I wish would have been in Fortnite years ago. All that being said, in 2 or 3 years, a lot can change. And as we've already seen, NetEase isn't above greedy business tactics. Overwatch was also, at one point, a heavily beloved game. Even World of Warcraft and Call of Duty, which have been fan-favorite franchises for decades, are now consistently finding it more difficult to maintain their player bases. And when you look at Overwatch, Call of Duty, and World of Warcraft, they're all made by different teams, but they're all owned by the same companies. This has also led to a massive decrease in single-player games. Some games that would be better built around a single-player experience are being developed as online games just for the excuse to make it live service. This isn't to say that live service games are to blame for all of the gaming industry's issues. Obviously, there was plenty of greed before this type of format ever came along. But it's important to remember that greed is the reason live service games exist. It wasn't easier to develop games in a live service format. It was cheaper. And the shift wasn't caused by people making the game. It was caused by the people who were selling it. Now, obviously the only way to counteract this would be maybe boycotting, but video games are seemingly way too addictive and widespread to ever formulate something like that. There will, after all, always be people who are willing to spend money on video games. And nothing proved this more effectively than rumors surrounding GTA 6. A few months ago, a games industry analyst made the controversial statement that higher-ups and stockholders within the gaming industry actually wanted GTA 6 to launch at a $100 price tag. This would supposedly initiate some sort of price increase across the whole industry. Obviously, this isn't going to happen. But the fact that thousands of people across the world had already decided that they were still going to buy the game at $100 is genuinely terrifying. The issue with the statements from that games industry analyst is that they seem to forget video games already release at well over $100. All you need are a few exclusive cosmetics items and maybe an in-game mission, and you're able to sell a game for upwards of $120. Hell, you could throw in a statue and sell it for $250, or claim you're supporting the devs and sell it for $380. The point is, there are plenty of ways to make money in the gaming industry. There are plenty of ways to incentivize players to spend more money in the gaming industry. And I think that's the issue. Every game we play is constantly begging us to spend money on it before they even deliver on their own promises. And when the community decides to stop spending money on the game and demand those changes, it ends up drying up the stream of revenue these games had. And instead of admitting their faults and changing their own systems, the higher-ups at these gaming studios will just end up laying people off and blaming them for their own mistakes. So what's the message that I'm trying to get across with this video? Live service games are dying. Supporting a game's development off of its own revenue is an incredibly smart business tactic. The issue is, that stream of money that seems so infinite does eventually run dry. People inevitably will lose interest in these games regardless. And every desperate attempt by these studios to recuperate what community they've lost will backfire and end up costing the studio even more players. If you don't believe me, just look at Apex Legends, or Destiny 2, or Call of Duty Warzone, or especially Halo Wait, no, don't look at that one. Don't look! Even when these games release content, it typically falls below community standards. And every change they make to try and recuperate what players they've lost will only end up chasing more players away. Now, and I know some of you are going to leave a comment, I am not saying our favorite games are about to drop off the face of the earth. Fortnite and a lot of these other games are going to be here for a very, very long time. And live service games as a whole aren't entirely new. As I said earlier in the video, World of Warcraft and even RuneScape were considered live service games well before Fortnite was even pitched. These games have survived for decades and will probably live on for decades more. But these techniques don't really seem to work well with newer games. The reason why is because there are simply too many of them. Like subscription services, every game seems to have a battle pass or some type of membership that players can subscribe to. These games are filled with temporary content that gets thrown away weeks after it's put into the game. Almost everything in these games is time limited to try and incentivize players to spend money on it right then and there. Fortunately for us consumers, this business formula doesn't seem to keep businesses alive, which will hopefully incentivize CEOs in the future not to adapt this type of formula. But before that happens, we're obviously going to see more games shut down, and along with them, studios. We could potentially lose a lot of developmental talent, and that doesn't sit right with me. There's not much more I really have to say on this topic. I'm sorry if this video felt a little bit messy. And if there's anything you think should be added to the discussion, please feel free to leave that in the comment section below as well. I really like reading what you guys have to say in the comments. Anyways, everyone, I think that's all for this video. If you enjoyed, please feel free to like and subscribe. It means the world to me, and it tells me you would like to see more content just like this. I hope you have a fantastic day or night depending on where you are, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye-bye.